The last 5 paragraphs of Force and Understanding sketch the final shape of empirical consciousness conceiving itself as understanding, and the lessons we, the phenomenological consciousness, are to learn from the achievement of this form of phenomenal consciousness as the culmination of the process of the development of the others that have been rehearsed in the consciousness chapters. The discussion is maddeningly compressed and telegraphic, both in its characterization of understanding conceiving itself under the concept of infinity, and in its account of how our understanding of that form of consciousness motivates turning our attention from consciousness to self-consciousness, and so motivates the crucial expository transition in the book from the consciousness chapters to self-consciousness. Infinity, Unendlichkeit, is Hegel's term for a distinctive structure of identity constituted by necessary relations among different moments, he says, each of which is what it is only in virtue of its relation to the others and its being comprised by the whole that it's a moment of. It's the final form of understanding consciousness. The structure of identity and difference that it labels, we are told, quote, has no doubt all along been the soul of all that has gone before, end quote. That is, it's the fully adequate conception of the actual structure of consciousness, which all the shapes considered up to this point, under the rubrics of empirical consciousness conceiving itself as sense certainty, as perceiving, and as understanding, are less adequate conceptions of. The principal lesson we're to learn from the final experience of understanding consciousness is that this holistic structure of identity and difference that results from this progressive process of making explicit what's implicit in empirical consciousness, what Hegel calls infinity, is the structure of self-consciousness. It's this discovery that the key to understanding empirical consciousness lies in self-consciousness that motivates for us the expository narrative transition from the consciousness chapters to the self-consciousness chapter. He says, quote, it's true that consciousness of an other, of an object in general, is itself necessarily self-consciousness, a reflectedness into self, consciousness of itself in otherness. The necessary advance from the previous shapes of consciousness, for which their truth was a thing, and other than themselves, expresses just this, that not only is consciousness of a thing only possible for a self-consciousness, but that self-consciousness alone is the truth of those shapes. There are at least 3 claims here. Each of the shapes of consciousness considered up to this point, including the final one, is a conception of, a way of understanding empirical consciousness. As such, they're forms of self-consciousness, that is, ways of being conscious of consciousness. Furthermore, quote, consciousness of a thing is possible only for self-consciousness. That is, any empirical consciousness must have some such shape, some such self-understanding. For it must be aware of the distinction between what to it things are in themselves and what to it they are for consciousness. And it has to have some particular way of understanding that. It's taught that by the experience of error. That aspect of consciousness incorporates a conception of consciousness and hence constitutes a form of self-consciousness. This much of Hegel's picture, I think, was already on offer in the introduction. What's new is a third claim about what becomes visible for us only in contemplating the final experience resulting in understanding consciousness, conceiving its object as infinite. This is the realization that, so conceived, the object of consciousness is no longer to it something other than consciousness. What things as they are in themselves is to consciousness just what it is to itself. This is the final sense in which consciousness is revealed to us as being self-consciousness. The challenge is to understand that claim. Empirical consciousness, understanding itself under the concept of infinity, understands consciousness as, he says, consciousness of a difference that is no less immediately cancelled. It's a distinguishing of that which contains no difference, or self-consciousness. I distinguish myself from myself, and in doing so, I'm directly aware that what is distinguished from myself is not different from me. I, the self-same being, repel myself from myself. But what is posited as distinct from me or as unlike me is immediately, in being so distinguished, not a distinction for me. End of the quote. The only feature of self-consciousness that's being invoked as that on which consciousness is now modeled is that the distinction the latter involves between consciousness and what it's consciousness of is a difference that essentially involves assimilating the distinguished items, as the self which is self-conscious is both nominally distinguished from and also necessarily identified with the self of which it is conscious. The task of understanding these passages is accordingly a matter of understanding what sort of identity in and through difference empirical consciousness understanding itself as infinite takes to characterize the intentional nexus, the distinction that consciousness essentially involves between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. What sort of assimilation of the two distinguished elements, one on the side of the objective world, the other on the side of subjective activity, is it that consciousness conceiving itself as having the structure Hegel calls infinity performs, which Hegel is telling us amounts to taking the two to be two ways of regarding one thing, as the self which is self-conscious and the self of which it is conscious are one self. Two sorts of assimilation are already on the table, what I called conceptual realism and what I called objective idealism. Conceptual realism says that what things are in themselves, no less than what things are for consciousness, is in conceptual shape. So when he says that in its final form, quote, the understanding experiences only itself, end of the quote, Hegel could mean just that what is to it, what things are in themselves, is already in conceptual shape, just as its thoughts are. I think indeed this is part of what's meant, but only part of it. Objective idealism says that the concepts articulating what is to understanding consciousness, what things are in themselves, and the concepts articulating what is to it, what things are for consciousness, are reciprocally sense-dependent. One consequence of the objective idealist thesis is that a necessary condition of understanding the ontological structure of the objective world empirical consciousness is consciousness of, is that one must also understand the epistemic activities by which consciousness becomes conscious of it. That, like the conceptual realist thesis, certainly is a sense in which in experiencing the world, understanding experiences itself. But I think that here, Hegel is also invoking a third idealist thesis, gesturing at something not explained here, marking it as something that we, his readers, will be in a position to understand only later in the book. He's doing what Sellers calls issuing a promissory note, to be redeemed later on. When we're in a position to unfold it, the thesis is what I'll call conceptual idealism. It's an account of the intentional nexus, that is, of the distinction and relation that consciousness consists in, the distinction between what things are in themselves objectively and what they are for consciousness or subjectively, the distinction between reality and appearance, noumena and phenomena, between what is thought and talked about, what empirical consciousness is consciousness of, and what is thought or said about it. Another way of characterizing the distinction and relation that conceptual idealism addresses, one that will prove particularly telling in the light of the use made of these terms in formulating objective idealism, is that it is the distinction and relation between reference and senses, between what is represented and representings of it. Its focus is on the process of experience. The argument of these closing passages of Force and Understanding has three phases. It starts with a characterization of the lessons to be learned from consideration of the final form of the supersensible world that understanding takes itself to confront, the inverted world. The second phase consists of remarks about the structure of identity in and through difference that Hegel calls infinity. And the concluding phase is the claim that we can see, though it cannot yet, that in conceiving its object on the model of such an infinite structure, phenomenal understanding consciousness has put itself in a position to recognize itself in its object, that it has actually become a form of consciousness that does not merely presuppose self-consciousness, but is to itself, but not explicitly for itself, a form of consciousness as self-consciousness. The task of understanding these crucial gnomic passages is accordingly the task of understanding the three lessons being taught about the inverted world as the final form of the supersensible world, infinity, and consciousness being in a position to recognize itself in its object, and the rationales that move us from one to the other of these three thoughts. Here's the first thought, leading into the second. He says, quote, "From the idea, then, of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea, the Vorstellung, of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. And this absolute notion of the difference must be presented and understood purely as inner difference. Certainly, I put the opposite here, and the other, of which it is the opposite, there. The opposite, then, is on one side, and is and for itself without the other. But just because I have the opposite here in and for itself, it's the opposite of itself, or it has in fact the other immediately present in it. Thus, the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched, übergriffen, the other world, and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, i.e. the inversion of itself. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, difference as an infinity." End of the quote. What's wrong with the inverted world is not the inversion, but the reification of it into a world. Just as what was wrong with the conception of the supersensible, calm realm of laws was the reification of laws into superfacts. In that case, the mistake was to assimilate statements of laws to ordinary empirical statements, taking the former to represent something in the same sense in which the latter represent facts. The representational semantic paradigm of representings and represented, of Fido and Fido, is extended beyond ground-level empirical, but not necessarily observable, statements and states of affairs to include modal statements of necessity in the form of laws, or of impossibility and necessity in the case of the inverted world. The inverted world is the result of inverting a world, but the result of doing that is not a world. It's the world, the actual world, the only world, which is partly supersensible, as inverted. Hegel is here diagnosing the mistake that Sellers calls descriptivism. Sellers says, quote, "Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, just different." End of the quote. To be a descriptivist about a vocabulary or kind of discourse is to take its characteristic expressive role to be describing or representing how things are. Hegel is rejecting descriptivism or representationalism for a lethic modal discourse, which, as we've seen, is the approach characteristic of contemporary possible worlds metaphysics for semantics. The alternative he's recommending in place of descriptivism is a distinctive kind of expressivism. The image Hegel is working with in the passage I cited before is that instead of picturing the exclusive contrasts in virtue of which actual states of affairs are the determinate states of affairs they are, as further states of affairs, separated from the actual by being across some ontological boundary, being jenseits, we picture them as within the actual, as implicit in it. Alethic modal statements about what's impossible, incompatible, or necessary express explicitly something that's implicit already in ordinary descriptive statements about actuality. Part of what it is to be copper, a necessary feature of copper, is to be an electrical conductor. That excludes the possibility of being an electrical insulator. Those modal features of copper are internal to it, implicit in something's being copper. Thinking of them as facts about another world, a shadow world, over and above the actual world, is mislocating them. Modal claims, it's true, do not simply describe the actual. Laws are not superfacts. But that's not because they describe something else. It's because they express something implicit in the actual instead of describing it all. They express the exclusive differences in virtue of which any actual state of affairs is the state of affairs that it is. In the final sentence of the passage I quoted, Hegel says that understanding the sense in which these determining exclusive differences are implicit in and constitutive of the determinate identity of anything or state of affairs will be understanding the structure he's calling infinity. That structure is the model for a non-descriptivist, expressivist semantics that encompasses representational structure but is more comprehensive, extending to the use of concepts whose principal expressive role is not to describe how things are. A first step towards understanding the expressivism Hegel is recommending is noting that it's a version of Kant's fundamental claim that some concepts, paradigmatically for him, those expressed by a lethic modal vocabulary in subjunctively robust conditionals, such as those underwritten by laws, have as their principal expressive role not empirical description, but rather making explicit features of the framework that makes empirical description possible. Since every empirical description presupposes what those framework concepts express, Kant says they must be knowable a priori. That is, in a way that does not depend on knowing whether any particular empirical description actually applies to anything. They're his categories. In Hegel's version, empirically describable states of affairs, both possible and actual, are intelligible as determinate only insofar as they stand in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, determinate negation and mediation. Those content-conferring relations are what are expressed explicitly by statements of law and the relations articulating what is misunderstood as the inverted world. So they play that framework explicating non-descriptive expressive role that Kant discovered, even though Hegel's account of the nature and significance of that discovery is different from Kant's. A further step to understanding how Hegel's notion of infinity differs from the Kantian idea on which it's built shows up in this passage, already cited in a different context, where he says, quote, "Infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement, in which whatever is determined in one way or another, e.g. as being, is rather the opposite of that determinateness. This, no doubt, has been all along the soul of all that has gone before. But it is as explanation that it first freely stands forth." The key claim is that infinity can only be understood in terms of the movement of understanding consciousness, which first shows up as what he calls traversing the moments, inferentially in explanation. Statements of necessary lawful consequence and expressions of exclusive difference as non-compossibility play their distinctive role in expressing norms governing these explanatory movements of the understanding. In this game, empirical descriptions specify positions, while modal statements of necessity and possibility constrain moves. The reifying descriptivist mistake Hegel diagnoses in the last two conceptions of supersensible worlds, the realm of laws and the inverted world, is to think of specifications of the moves on the representational model of specifications of further positions, which then must be thought of as positions of a very special kind. To understand the sense in which the modal articulation of the objective empirical world is not to be understood as something alongside the actual world, not even in a universe of merely possible worlds, but rather as something within it, something implicit in it, then, we must focus on the process that Hegel calls the movement of the understanding. He tells us that that movement first shows up in the development of understanding consciousness in the guise of understanding conceiving of itself as explaining. That's the process, inter alia, of making what's implicit in the actual empirical world, as it is in itself, explicit for consciousness. The movement of the understanding that first shows up as inferentially traversing the moments in explanation is an aspect of the larger movement that in the introduction Hegel calls experience. And remember that at the time he wrote this chapter, the working title of the book was The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. The focus of the discussion of experience in the introduction is the experience of error. The aspect of conceptual content on which inferential explanation turns is necessary consequential relations of the sort made explicit in statements of law. The aspect of conceptual content on which the experience of error turns is material incompatibility, or exclusive difference, since the experience of error is triggered by finding oneself with incompatible commitments. The broadening of topic from what's representationally reified by descriptivist understanding consciousness as the calm realm of laws to what it representationally reifies as the inverted world accordingly corresponds to a widening of focus from one focused on explanation to one that encompasses also the experience of error. In the discussion of Hegel's introduction, I offered an account of the experience of error that was also informed by looking ahead to the lessons I take to be put in place in the later reason chapter. Hegel's conception of experience is built on Kant's account of the cognitive activity that, as he puts it, synthesizes an original unity of apperception. The unity in question is a rational unity of doxastic commitments, governed by a regulative ideal that I take to comprise at least three dimensions of rational obligation. Knowers in the Kantian picture have an ampliative rational task responsibility to acknowledge commitment to the inferential consequences of their commitments. They have a justificatory rational task responsibility to have reasons providing evidence for their commitments. And they have a critical rational task responsibility to acknowledge and repair incompatibilities among their commitments. A constellation of judgments that evolves, as Kant has it, is synthesized in response to these rational demands exhibits the rational structural unity distinctive of apperception. In his conception of experience as the experience of error, Hegel emphasizes the critical rational task responsibility, the responsibility to resolve conflicts arising from the material incompatibility of judgments. Already with Kant, judgments are intelligible as such, as semantically contentful, just in virtue of standing in the relations of material incompatibility and necessary consequence appealed to by the rational task responsibilities governing their synthetic integration into an apperceptive unity. Hegel is impressed by the pragmatist order of explanation implicit in Kant's story, the way in which the notion of semantic content is to be understood in terms of pragmatics, that is, functionally, in terms of the role of what then become intelligible as judgments in the practical discursive process that Hegel calls experience, the process that synthesizes a constellation of doxastic commitments exhibiting a rational apperceptive unity. I mean, the remarkable thing about Kant's story is that's what it is to be aware of anything, is to make a judgment that is something that is playing a role in this ongoing process. As we saw in discussing the introduction, the rational requirement to revise one's commitments in the face of their incompatibility gives experience the shape of a continual unmasking of what was to consciousness the way things are in themselves, what it took to be the facts expressed by true judgments, gets unmasked as appearance, as merely what things were for consciousness. In addition to this emphasis on and interpretation of the significance of the critical dimension of the rational responsibilities constitutive of Kantian apperception, Hegel adds a further one that's decisive for his account of experience. It's a recollective rational task responsibility, given prominent place at the meta level in absolute knowing under the heading of Erinnerung. Hegelian vindicating recollective stories at the ground level of empirical knowledge have the same structure as the ones Hegel tells in the Phenomenology at the meta level of shapes of consciousness. Such stories exhibit a sequence of constellations of commitments, each stage of which leads to the next by a recounted experience of error. That is, each stage is found to contain an anomaly, a set of materially incompatible commitments, which might have been acquired either inferentially through the exercise of the knower's ampliative task responsibility to extract necessary consequences of prior commitments, or immediately through the exercise of non-inferential perceptual capacities. The next stage is reached as a result of a determinate attempt to repair the anomaly that's thereby acknowledged as such as the exercise of the knower's critical task responsibility. The response to critical registration of the joint material incompatibility of a set of commitments, that is, acknowledging them as incompatible, is practically accepting a normative obligation to do something to repair the epistemic situation, resolving the incompatibility. The repair phase can reestablish material coherence by revising, on the one hand, the doxastic commitments, and on the other hand, the consequential and incompatibility commitments relating them to other possible doxastic commitments. Revision might involve rejection of some commitments of either kind, or it might consist in less drastic adjustments and refinements. So, finding oneself with commitments to the liquid tasting sour and turning litmus paper blue, one is obliged to revise one's acid concept that says that whatever would taste sour is an acid, and whatever is an acid would turn litmus paper red. One might do so by further qualifying the circumstances of appropriate application one takes to articulate the concept's content, so that only clear liquids that would taste sour count as acids, while preserving the consequences of application. Vindication differs from justification in part by its wider scope. For recollective rehearsal, retrospectively rationally reconstructs not only the development of the beliefs currently held, but also of the concepts that articulate them. To understand this role of the recollective phase of experience, it's helpful to think of it in Fregean terms of sense and reference. This terminology was already invoked at two prior points in my story, in explaining first conceptual realism and then objective idealism. Thinking in these terms about how recollective rational reconstruction vindicates constellations of discursive commitments, comprising both explicit doxastic and implicit incompatibility and inferential species, provides a framework into which to set both conceptual realism and objective idealism, so as to deepen our understanding of and appreciation of their significance. In the generic way in which I want to approach these terms, talk about senses is talk about what's sayable and thinkable. It's what is in suitable conceptual shape to be the content of possible knowings. In Hegel's terms, it's a matter of what things can be for consciousness. Talk of reference is talk about what's talked or thought about, what is there to be possibly known, the objective realm of things as they actually are in themselves. Expressed in this idiom, conceptual realism is the claim that how things objectively are in themselves, the totality of facts, no less than its appearances to consciousness in thought, how things are for consciousness, is conceptually structured and so sense-like. The realm of reference is a subregion of the realm of senses. The conceptual realm of graspable senses has no outer boundary. Considering recollective processes will make visible a distinctively Hegelian rendering of the distinction and relation between sense and reference that vindicates conceptual realism in the face. Vindicates conceptual realism. It will also explain and justify the appeal made to the sense-reference distinction in formulating the thesis of objective idealism, asserting the reciprocal sense dependence but not reference dependence of concepts articulating the ontological structure of the objective world, concepts such as object, property, fact, and law on the one hand, and the concepts articulating the processes and practices of talking and thinking about that world, such as referring, describing, judging or asserting, and inferring, and so concepts such as singular term, predicate, declarative sentence, and subjunctive conditional. A recollective clarification of what I'm talking about as Hegel's understanding of the distinction between senses and referents, thinkables and what's thought about, representings and representeds, might begin with the Tarskian order of semantic explanation, whose greatest poet and prophet is Quine. It starts with a domain of objects and sets of objects as extensions, that is, referents of singular terms and predicates. The strict Tarski-Quine semantics remains rigorously extensional, that is, it appeals only to reference. Taking its cue from the constant intentions logical vocabulary exhibits in the framework of extensional model theory, however, the possible worlds framework elaborated by Montague, Lewis, and Stalnaker shows how to erect a full-blown intentional semantics as a theory of senses, as a superstructure resting on the extensional Tarskian base. Senses show up as intentions, represented semantically by functions from indices, paradigmatically possible worlds, to extensions. This intentional semantics remains true to its Tarskian roots in that the order of explanation is from reference to sense, from extension to intention. By contrast, the originator of the terminology of Sinn and Bedeutung that we're considering, Frege, as I read him, introduces it in the context of an order of explanation that begins with senses and explains reference in terms of them. Senses are something like inferential roles. I'm skipping a long discussion of the Frege account. Hegel's account of the distinction and relation between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves, which I'm recommending thinking of in terms of senses and reference, is like the Fregean and unlike the Tarskian, in that the semantic order of explanation it adopts begins with senses rather than reference. It's distinguished from the Fregean account in that where Frege looked to a dyadic symmetric relation between senses, namely intersubstitutability salva veritate, to forge the link between sense and referent, the Hegelian account looks to asymmetric sequences of senses to do so. A recollective reconstruction assembles appearances, ways things have been for consciousness, into histories that display them as successive appearances of an underlying reality, presented by the constellation of claims and concepts in which that history culminates, at least so far. The recollection exhibits a process by which how things really are in themselves, according to it, was gradually, fitfully, but ultimately successfully revealed by different appearances of it. It traces an expressively progressive trajectory through the senses by which the referent was finally presented to the consciousness that thereby comes to know about it as it is in itself. The sequence of senses is expressively progressive in that each successive step shows up as the making explicit of some feature of how things really are that can now be seen, retrospectively, to have been all along implicit in prior appearances of it. Each progressive step consists in an experience of error, the presence of an anomaly in the form of incompatible commitments, then acknowledgement of the anomaly in the form of an effective practical obligation to repair it, a revision of beliefs and concepts, that is, doxastic commitments and commitments concerning material incompatibility and inferential consequence, a revision that resolves the difficulty, and a story about what it was about the situation as it is thus discovered to be that accounts for the prior appearance, both insofar as it's now taken to have been veridical and insofar as it's now taken not to have been veridical. The rationally reconstructed history vindicates both the beliefs, the doxastic commitments, the currently endorsed view comprises, and the concepts, the material, inferential, and incompatibility commitments that articulate those beliefs. On this Hegelian account, what is to consciousness the way things are in themselves, the reality that has been being thought about all along, a referent, is a way they can be for consciousness, an appearance of that reality, a sense that is rationally endorsed, i.e., to which it is committed as how things really are. The endorsement is rational in acknowledging rational task responsibilities of all four kinds governing the experience of error: ampliative, critical, justificatory, and crucially, recollective. That is, the endorsement is shown by recollection to arise in response to acknowledging material inferential consequences and incompatibilities, giving reasons, and historically vindicating the concepts articulating the commitments and their applications in judgment. The retrospective, recollective, rational reconstruction of how the truth was discovered at every point culminates in an appearance then endorsed as veridical, as one in which how things are in themselves shows up as being just how they are for consciousness. The other appearances are displayed as a sequence of progressively more and more adequate appearances of that eventually revealed reality. In this way, the noumenon-phenomenon distinction is drawn within the realm of phenomena. Referents are a privileged kind of sense. Intentional aboutness, representation, is reconstructed as a relation within the conceptually articulated realm of graspable senses. Descriptions and what is described are the same kind of thing. Hegelian individuals, which are particulars as characterized by universals. This such as, that state of affairs that S is P. What's described is presented by the true description of it. This is an account of how the distinction that consciousness essentially involves between how things are in themselves and how they are for consciousness, what he articulates in the introduction as the distinction between truth and certainty, arises within consciousness and is something to it. It is accordingly a story about consciousness of consciousness. That is, it's a story about self-consciousness. It's an understanding of what experience consists in. It is at every stage an experience of error, and at the same time an experience of the revelation of truth. The process of recollectively, retrospectively, rationally reconstructing an expressive and progressive trajectory through the welter of actual experiences of error to yield senses, a constellation of commitments, both doxastic and the material consequential and incompatibility commitments that articulate them, that are endorsed as presenting how things actually are in themselves, what all the other senses have been all along and more faithfully representing, defines a distinctive sense in which what is discerned as having been implicit is expressed explicitly. The reality that the successive appearances are presented as appearances of, the represented reference that they, according to the recollective story, have all along been about, is seen as having been implicit in them. The recollected sequence of experience vindicates the constellation of commitments in which it culminates by showing how what was implicit comes gradually to be expressed, how it emerges step by step into the light of explicit day. This sense in which experience is the path of truth as the making explicit of the reality that was semantically implicit in the sequence of never wholly veridical appearances, in the sense of being what those representings represent, must be carefully distinguished from the sense in which the relations of material incompatibility and consequence, of the sort expressed explicitly by statements of law, are implicit in the determinate facts and possible states of affairs that they govern. Understanding consciousness conceived itself and its object as having the structure Hegel calls infinity. It is won through by its meta-level experience, as Hegel recollects it for us, to the realization that objective facts are conceptually structured. They and the properties they involve are determinate only insofar as they stand in modal relations of necessary consequence and incompatibility to each other and to other possible states of affairs and properties. All properties are modally involved because being determinate is incompatible with being modally insulated. It's in this sense that the alethic modal relations made explicit by statements of laws are implicit in the objective facts, whatever they are. On Hegel's hylomorphic conception of conceptual content, the same structure visible in the objective pole of the objects of knowledge is mirrored on the deontic side of the subjects of knowledge. Doxastic commitments as to how things really are, objectively, have the determinate conceptual contents they do only in virtue of being articulated by commitments to the goodness of subjunctively robust material inferential relations and relations of material incompatibility. On the side of the cognitive activity of subjects, these are deontic normative relations, norms according to which a commitment with one content necessarily commits one to endorsing other contents that follow from it and precludes one from entitlement to still others. In each case, the modal relations of consequence and incompatibility, whether alethic or deontic, are to be understood as implicit in, as conceptually articulating the contents of thinkables, both facts and judgments. We've seen that this hylomorphic conceptual realism is explicated further by the claims of objective idealism. It asserts the reciprocal sense dependence of concepts expressing the ontological structure of objective reality, concepts such as object, property, fact, and law, and concepts expressing framework constituting features of norm-governed discursive activities, practices, or processes, such as referring, classifying, asserting, and inferring. The perception chapter explains the sense in which relations of material incompatibility and consequence must be thought of as implicit in taking the objective world to consist of facts about properties characterizing objects, and the Force and Understanding chapter does the same for a broadened conception of facts and the subjectively robust consequential and incompatibility relations implicit in them. But this is not the sense of implicit, in which recollection displays how things are in themselves as the explicit expression of what was all along implicit in the earlier stages of a reconstructed sequence of appearances of that reality for consciousness. So it wants to keep separate books on these notions of implicit and explicit. To understand the recollective sense of making what's implicit explicit, we must already understand that the sense that emerges already from the hylomorphic picture of conceptual content as showing up both in objective form as facts implicitly articulated by alethic modal relations of necessary consequence and non-compossibility, and in subjective form as judgings articulated by deontic normative relations of material inference and incompatibility. And the recollective sense of implicitness in its expression, understood as a theory of the semantic relation between senses and their reference, progressively transforms our understanding of the distinction between reference dependence and sense dependence, which is critical to the specification of the claims constitutive of objective idealism, by making possible the transposition of the sense-reference distinction from the Fregean key in which it was introduced into a distinctively Hegelian one. The path to what I've been calling conceptual idealism is paved by the recollective construal of the sense in which the in itself, Ansichtsein, is implicit in how things are for consciousness. Hegel says, quote, "Already something thought, the content is the property of individuality. Existence has no more to be changed into the form of what is in itself and implicit, Ansichtsein, but only the implicit into the form of what is explicit, of what is objective to self, of Vorsichtsein." The best way to understand what Hegel is saying here, I think, is to pair it with one of the claims with which the meta-recollection that is the whole of the phenomenology concludes. He says in the Absolute Knowing section, quote, "Recollection, Erinnerung, the inwardizing of that experience, has preserved it and is the inner being, and in fact is the higher form of the substance." Close quote. Conceptual idealism is ultimately to be understood in terms of the process of making what is implicit explicit. This is a dimension of making that turns out to be an essential aspect of finding. Engaging in the full ongoing experience of error, including the recollective reconstructive phases that show it to be the revelation of truth, is what subjects must do in order thereby to discover how things anyway already objectively were. One important strand of German idealism, starting already with Kant, is a recoil from the idea of knowing as having as its ideal the passive reflection of how things are, with no omissions and alterations. In its place, they put an orienting concern with knowing as a distinctive kind of practical doing. Hegel's conceptual idealism, as I understand it, develops from consideration of the sense in which recollection produces the in itself that it reveals as what is represented by the sequence of more or less adequate representings of it. The sense of making or producing the reality behind appearances, of the reference that those senses represent as the product of this recollective activity, is sui generis. To begin with, it's emphatically not to be confused with reference dependence. The claim is not that recollectively reconstructing a course of experience, so revealing it as at once driven by error and the process by which truth is discovered, does not causally bring into existence the objective reality it comes to know. On the contrary, things would still largely be as they objectively are, even if there were no knowers. Nor is it a relation of mere sense dependence. Recollection is the doing that produces the distinction, essential to consciousness, of what is to consciousness what things objectively are in themselves, and what is to consciousness only how those things appear for consciousness. It, recollection, is what we must understand to understand how that distinction can show up to consciousness itself, and hence why and how the concept of consciousness essentially involves the concept of self-consciousness. But sense dependence is an essentially semantic relation, a relation between senses or concepts. Conceptual idealism asserts rather a dependence of semantics on pragmatics, for it explains the semantic relation between sense and reference in terms of the activity of recollecting, an activity, a practice, a process. In its broadest usage, pragmatics is the study of discursive activities, practices, or processes, such things as referring, describing, fact-stating, and inferring. So the sui generis asymmetric dependence relation asserted by conceptual idealism is not to be assimilated either to reference dependence or to sense dependence for two reasons. First, the semantic relations it addresses are not between reference and reference, or senses and senses, but between senses and reference. And second, the dependence it asserts is not in the first instance a semantic dependence at all. It's rather the mode of dependence of the semantic relation between senses and reference on the pragmatic activity of subjects who manipulate senses through all the phases and aspects of experience in order to determine the relation between representing senses and the reference that they represent. If we view how it stands between thought, in the sense of episodes of thinking, and the thinkable facts that are thought about, from the retrospective vantage point afforded by a recollective vindication of some endorsed constellation of doxastic commitments concerning what is actual, and subjunctively robust commitments concerning relations of consequence and incompatibility, we can regard that intentional nexus either from the objective side of what is known or from the subjective side of the knowing of it. The currently endorsed commitments are presented as constituting genuine knowledge, which is to say that things are in themselves what they are for consciousness. One constellation of conceptual contents takes two forms. On the objective side is facts and their implicit alethic modal involvements, and on the subjective side is judgments and their implicit deontic normative involvements. The recollective vindication of this so far culminating stage of the development of what Hegel now calls the concept explains how representing senses come to track the represented reference nomologically, and also by the same process how represented reference come to govern the representing senses normatively. The first is a matter of alethic modal relations of the kind characteristic of the represented objective world. The second is a matter of deontic normative practices of the kind characteristic of the representing subject's activity. So, let me say that again because this is a new thought, that the recollective story you can think about either in objective terms or in subjective terms. In objective terms, it's telling you how it is that the senses came nomologically to track the reference, what things really were there. Nomological tracking, that's alethic modality, that's on the objective side. But it's also telling you how those referents that emerged from the recollective process come to normatively govern, to determine the correctness or incorrectness of moves made with the senses. That normative government, that's a matter of deontic normative relations, that's on the side of the subject. Both of those are to be understood as two sides of one coin in terms of this recollective process. They're both systematic dependences, both the tracking of reference by senses and the governing of the normative governing of senses by reference. Those are both systematic dependences, but neither of the reference dependence nor of the sense dependence semantic variety, even when reference and sense are understood on the Hegelian rather than the Fregean model. They concern rather the semantogenic alethic relations and deontic processes that institute the semantic relations between senses and their reference. The recollective reconstruction of experience exhibits the progressive achievement of, on the one hand, an alethic modal tracking relation supporting subjunctively robust inferences from how things are for consciousness to how they are in themselves, and on the other hand, deontic normative practices whereby how things are in themselves serves as a normative standard for assessments of the correctness of the deontic commitments that constitute how they are for consciousness. Conceptual idealism, in asserting the distinctive kind of explanatory and conceptual priority of pragmatics over semantics that's embodied in taking the recollective dimension of experience to provide the framework within which to understand the institution of semantic relations between representing senses and representing reference, thereby asserts a practical priority of and an asymmetric dependence relation between norm-governed experiential practices made explicit by the use of deontic vocabulary, and nomological tracking relations made explicit by the use of alethic vocabulary. The fact that the ampliative, critical, and recollective rational task responsibilities normatively govern the manipulation of conceptual contents of senses in the process of experience constitutes the experiencing subjects practically treating how things are in themselves as providing a normative standard for assessing the correctness of how things are for consciousness. And it's that norm-governed process that selectively institutes, shapes, and refines the nomological tracking of how things are in themselves by how things are for consciousness, of reference by senses. Hylomorphic conceptual realism, which makes intelligible the possibility of genuine knowledge by understanding conceptual content as actualizable in two forms, an objective form articulated by alethic modal relations of necessary consequence and non-compossibility, and a subjective form articulated by deontic normative relations of necessary consequence and non-compossibility. And the objective idealism, which asserts the reciprocal sense dependence of concepts articulating the ontological structure of the objective world and concepts articulating the pragmatic structure of subjective discursive practices, both exhibit the intentional nexus in terms that are symmetric as between its objective and its subjective poles. The conceptual idealism, though, that digs deeper to explain these less radical Hegelian theses, breaks this symmetry. It asserts both a practical and a conceptual priority of norm-governed discursive practices over alethic modal relations in understanding what it is for there to be an objective world that is at once the cause of sense and goal of intellect. The first, a nomological matter, and the second, a normative one. In vindicating one constellation of senses as veridical, conferring on them the normative status of expressing explicitly how things have all along implicitly really been, as what was represented by the representing senses that were its more or less adequate appearances, which is the status of serving as a normative standard for assessing the correctness of all such appearances, a recollective reconstruction of experience selects the alethic relations of senses tracking reference that matter semantically. This sense in which recollection produces what things are in themselves, the represented reference semantically implicit in the representing senses, is non-causal production, because talk of causation is couched in an Analytic modal vocabulary. I've described it as sui generis because of the way in which it's distinguished from the semantic relations of reference dependence, of which causal dependence is a principal species, and of sense dependence. There is, however, as we'll discover in reading the reason chapter, an analogous sort of production that arises in considering exercises of intentional agency. The analogy here is not, as one might be led to expect by popular misunderstandings that assimilate Hegel's idealism to Berkeleyan subjective idealism. It's not the sense in which a practical agent produces a deed. Rather, it's the sense in which the agent recollectively produces an intention as what the deed makes explicit. The deed is indeed causally reference dependent on the intention, as the knowing is causally reference dependent on what's known, but the cause that is in each case found by the agent knower is, in the sui generis sense, made, produced as the product of the vindicatory retrospective recollective process. They're both, the cognitive and the practical species of recollective producings, instances of the distinctive kind of constrained making that is finding out how things always, already, anyway were. It's this analogy between knowing and doing, in virtue of which understanding consciousness, taking its object to have the structure of infinity, finds itself in its object, and thereby to it, consciousness shows up, we can see, as a form of self-consciousness. Although, quote, it is only for us that this truth exists, not yet for consciousness, end of the quote, Hegel says. In fact, the final form of understanding consciousness is distinguished from the previous shapes of consciousness, for which their truth was a thing, and other than themselves, expresses just this, that not only is consciousness of a thing only possible for self-consciousness, but that self-consciousness alone is the truth of those shapes. Because it's its activity that you have to understand the distinction between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. At this final stage, quote, what is for the understanding an object in a sensuous covering is for us in its essential form as a pure notion, Begriff, end of the quote. For that reason, we can see that the understanding experiences only itself, as Hegel says, not something experienced as other than itself. Quote, since this notion of infinity is an object for consciousness, the latter is consciousness of a difference that is no less immediately cancelled. Consciousness is for its own self. It is a distinguishing of that which contains no difference, or self-consciousness. End of the quote. Well, what does that mean? In what sense is the distinction between the subject of knowledge and the object of knowledge now considered to be not a distinction? What sort of difference is being denied? The three theses into which I've divided the idealism being recommended here, conceptual realism, objective idealism, and conceptual idealism, offer a succession of ever deeper answers to this question. Each offers a sense in which the intentional nexus is understood as a distinctive kind of unity that in different senses cancels the distinction between its necessarily related poles in virtue of their necessarily being bound into just the sort of unity that they are. The first tells us that among the differences being denied is any strong difference of intelligibility between what's known and the knowing of it, of exactly the sort that in the introduction was diagnosed as leading to the impossibility of satisfying the genuine knowledge constraint, and hence to semantically enforced epistemological skepticism. Conceptual realism says that when the understanding consciousness looks out at what to it is the in itself, it sees something already in conceptual shape, a world that is conceptually contentful just as its own thinking is. Consciousness's own thinking confront a thinkable world. There is no gulf of intelligibility separating intrinsically intelligible thinkings from intrinsically unintelligible, or at least not intrinsically intelligible, things thought about. Consciousness is conceptually structured, and the world it knows about is conceptually structured. Objective idealism goes further, showcasing the particularly intimate connection between these two forms conceptual content can take. That connection manifests itself in the fact that at the meta level, the concepts used to express explicitly key features of the modal ontological structure of the objective world, and the concepts used to express explicitly key features of the deontic normative structure of discursive practices and processes are reciprocally sense-dependent. What it means to say or think that the world consists of facts about the possession of properties by objects and lawful connections among them has to be understood in terms of concepts making explicit what one is doing in asserting declarative sentences by referring to objects with singular terms and classifying them by applying predicates, in endorsing subjunctively robust inferences between what those sentences express. In this sense, neither form conceptual content can take, objective and subjective, is intelligible considered all on its own, apart from its relation to the other. In this sense, too, there's no gulf separating them. They mutually presuppose one another, not in a causal reference-dependent sense, but in the rational sense-dependent sense. The task of understanding the most basic ontological structure of the world turns consciousness back to the terms it uses to make explicit its own discursive activity. In a final further step, conceptual idealism asserts that when, as self-conscious, in the sense of being conscious of itself as conscious, consciousness distinguishes between its certainty and truth, between what things are for it and what they are in themselves, between appearance and reality, representings and representeds, it is neither alienating itself from itself nor acknowledging a confrontation with something alien to it. It's finding out how things really are is a distinctive kind of active recollective making of that distinction, which is essential to consciousness as such, through its experience. The world as it is in itself, as distinct from how it is for consciousness, is not a brute other, but in a distinctive sense the product of its own recollective activity and experience. In this sense, it finds only what it has made, and not only made findable. In this sense, it sees itself in the objects of its knowledge, even insofar as they transcend that knowledge. Understanding the object of knowledge conceptually, as Begriff, means reconstruing representational relations within a model of practices of explicitly expressing the implicit. The focus is not on the object as something simply there, but on what Hegel calls the coming to be of the object, its emergence into explicitness. By contrast to representational thinking, he says, quote, speculative, begreifendes, thinking behaves in a different way. Since the Begriff is the object's own self, which presents itself as the coming to be of the object, it's not a passive subject inertly supporting the accidents. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving Begriff, which takes its determinations back into itself. In this movement, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences in the content, and thus constitutes the determinateness, i.e. the differentiated content and its movement, instead of remaining inertly over against it. And only this movement itself becomes the object. Close quote. In a move foreshadowed by understanding the modal relations of necessity and non-compossibility, articulating the conceptual contentfulness in virtue of which objective states of affairs are not understood representationally as denizens of some other ontological realm, but expressively as implicit in how things actually are, conceptual idealism presents how things are in themselves as implicit in how they are for consciousness. In a sense of implicit, operationalized by recollective recovery of the reality exhibited as implicit in a rationally reconstructed sequence of partial expressions of it in appearance. This realization is the rationale for turning our narrative attention in the phenomenology from consciousness to self-consciousness, which has turned out, in Hegel's term, to be the truth. Thank you.